Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Okay, so about a month ago now, I purchased the Core i5-12400 for an in-depth review, and I found that for $180 US, which is the price for the F SKU, it represented excellent value, especially for gamers. The only hiccup being that the B660 motherboards weren't really, the availability wasn't great at the time. The boards that were available were a bit pricey, but I expected that would resolve itself over the coming weeks. 3 weeks have now passed and B660 boards are finally becoming available, though not as many as we would have liked to have seen, and pricing is still a bit inflated. Though that is of course to be expected, as we saw the same thing happen with B560 for a few months, and even AMD's B550 motherboards suffered from similar issues. Still, you can buy a decent looking budget B660 motherboard for $140 US, such as the Gigabyte B660M DS3H AX or the Asus Prime B660 Plus D4. Now, when I reviewed the 12400, I estimated that you should be able to buy a decent B660 motherboard for around $160 US, and that would make that part an excellent value option and really unrivaled in the sub $200 US CPU market, and that does now indeed appear to be the case. But what if you wanted to spend even less on your CPU? Previously, for such a buyer, I was recommending the Core i3-10100F, which was selling for $120 US back in October of last year, but has since fallen, and as of mid-November 2021, it was down to $92 US, and now it's down to just $85 US, which is a crazy price given how capable that CPU still is, and with decent B560 motherboards down around $110, it's a really hard budget combo to beat. That said, the new Core i3-12100F, that's coming in at $120 US, and with 4 P cores should easily outperform the 10100F for what really is quite a small price premium. Yeah, it is 40% more expensive, but we're only talking about $35 US here, so that's not that much for what should be a much more powerful CPU. So that's one of the angles we'll be looking at today, while also comparing the 12100F to several other relevant parts. But before we jump into the benchmark data, let's quickly go over the 12100F specs and then take a look at the test system. As I just mentioned, this base model Core i3 processor packs 4 P cores, which operate at up to 4.3 GHz, and with the support of hyperthreading, there are 8 threads. It also includes a 12 MB L3 cache, UHD 730 graphics for the non-F SKU version, and a max turbo rating of 89 watts. So those really are the key specifications. Now, for testing the Core i3-12100F, I'm using the MSI B660M Mono Wi-Fi DDR4 motherboard with 32 GB of dual-rank, dual-channel DDR4 3200CL14 memory. And this is the same stuff I use for all of our DDR4 testing, and it's typically faster than single-rank DDR4 3800 CL18 memory in terms of performance. Now, the K-SKU Alder Lake CPUs have been tested using the MSI Z690 Tomahawk Wi-Fi DDR4, again using the same memory, and all boards have been updated to the latest BIOS revision. I've also updated the Ryzen data using the MSI X570S Tomahawk Wi-Fi motherboard. Also, all gaming data has been updated for the AM4 and LJ1700 CPUs with resizable bar enabled. The plan was to do the same with the Intel 10th and 11th Gen Core processors as well, but performance seemed to go backwards there in all instances we looked at with rebar enabled. So for now, I've left this PCI Express feature disabled on those older platforms. Finally, the last test system notes worth mentioning is the fact that all application and gaming data has been collected using the AMD Radeon RX 6900 XT graphics card, and the operating system of choice here was Windows 11. Okay, I think that covers everything. Let's dive into the results. Starting with the Cinebench R23 multi-core benchmark, we find that while certainly not the most impressive CPU we've tested as of late, the 12100F is still mighty impressive for what it is, and perhaps more importantly, what it costs. The IPC of Alder Lake is so strong that just 4 P cores can rival the multi-core performance of a 10th gen 6-core 12-thread processor like the 10600K, and even AMD's Zen 2 based Ryzen 5 3600. That means for productivity tasks, the 12100F is going to be just fine for lighter workloads, and by that I mean basic video editing, rendering, and so on. It also means that although this is just a quad-core processor, you might have to adjust your expectations for what that looks like in terms of performance. And that's because here we're looking at an almost 60% increase in performance over the previous generation quad-core, the 10100F, as there weren't any 11th gen Rocket Lake Core i3s. Finally, it's interesting to note that even when limited to the 58 watt base power spec, the Core i3 12100F delivered basically the same result as the 89 watt turbo spec, suggesting that this part doesn't use much over 58 watts for its sustained all-core performance. In fact, I found when monitoring CPU package power that the 12100F didn't exceed 57 watts, at least in this benchmark, so any difference between these two configurations should be within the margin of error. Of course, the reason why the 12100F is so much faster than the previous generation quad cores and is able to match fairly modern 6-core 12-thread processors is because of Alder Lake's strong IPC gains. Here we're looking at comparable single-core performance to that of the Ryzen 7 5800X, so faster than that of the 11600K and 27% faster than the 10th gen core series. So a very impressive result indeed. Moving on to the 7-zip file manager results, the 12100F doesn't look super impressive when it comes to compression performance, but also for a CPU priced at just over $100 US, it's kind of great, offering an almost 30% boost over the 10100F and just 20 to 22% less performance than the previous generation 6-core parts such as the Core i5 10600K and Ryzen 5 3600. Sadly though, the decompression performance is a lot less impressive, as here the 12100F is barely any faster than the 10100F and is now 42% slower than the Ryzen 5 3600. The 12th gen Core i3 processor was quite impressive in the Corona benchmark, completing the test in 174 seconds, though it was 6% slower when power limited. Based on what was seen when observing the package power in Cinebench, this 6% performance difference doesn't really make sense, so I again looked at the package power in Corona, and it appeared to max out at just 52 watts, which means both configurations should have delivered the same result. It is possible though that the package power reporting is inaccurate, but whatever the case, this is the resulting performance when limited to the 58 watt spec, opposed to the unlimited spec, let's say. In short, the 12100F was 39% faster than the 10100F and just 17% slower than the Ryzen 5 3600. Now, for budding content creators, purchasing the 12100F, it's really not a crazy idea. If you're building or upgrading a PC on a tight budget, this is the best entry-level performance you can get for just over $100. The next best thing would be the 10400F, which would be around 10% slower than the 10600K. But as it stands, the 12100F is just 6% slower than the 10600K and 24% slower than the 12400. But when compared to the 10100F, we're looking at a massive 42% increase in performance. The new 12th gen Core i3 is also very handy for those of you needing to get some Photoshop work done, as here the performance is comparable to that of the 11600K, 3700X and 10700K. So some pretty high-end CPUs there. It was also 37% faster than the 10100F, so again a very impressive jump over the previous generation Core i3 part. The last Adobe application that we're going to look at is After Effects, and again the 12100F appears surprisingly capable, roughly matching the performance of the Ryzen 5 5600X in the Puget Systems benchmark. Of course, I don't doubt that serious users making money from their work in After Effects probably won't opt for the Core i3 12100F, but for those of you starting out, this budget CPU doesn't seem like a bad option, despite being a lowly quad-core. Once again, I'm including Factorio in the application benchmarks, as we're not measuring FPS but rather updates per second. This automated benchmark calculates the time it takes to run 1000 updates, and this is a single thread test which apparently relies heavily on cache performance. Due to the strong single core performance of the 12100F, we see that it scores very well with 189 points, making it just 6% slower than the 5600X and 12400, but also 16% faster than the 11600K and 22% faster than the 10600K. And next up, we have code compilation performance, and again, the 12100F wasn't a great deal slower than previous generation 6-core 12-thread processors, such as the 10600K and 3600. We're talking about just an 8% increase in completion time. Meanwhile, the 12100F reduced the compile time by just over 30% to the 10100F. The last application benchmark we're going to look at is Blender, and the margins here are fairly similar to what we've already seen. The 12100F reduced the render time by 26% when compared to the 10100F, while it was just 21% slower than the 10600K. Essentially, you're getting half the performance of the 5800X while spending 3 times less. When it comes to power consumption, the 1200F is extremely efficient. We're looking at roughly the same total system usage as the 10100F for around 30% greater performance. Pretty incredible performance for a CPU that's only consuming between 50 to 60 watts. Okay, so time to see how this quad-core handles gaming, and we'll start with a relatively easy title in F1 2021. Here the 12100F was capable of driving up to 292 FPS on average while keeping 1% lows above 200 FPS. So I think it's fair to say very playable performance there. Of course, the older 10100F was also very capable in F1 2021, but we're still looking at an 18% performance uplift. Perhaps more importantly is the fact that the 12100F was just 6% slower than the 10600K, 10% slower than the 11600K, and just 12% slower than the 12400F. It's probably also worth noting that it was 26% faster than the R5 3600, so overall great performance from this new Core i3 processor. The 12100F was also very capable when testing with Rainbow Six Siege, averaging around 400 FPS with 1% lows over 300 FPS. This placed it on par with the Ryzen 5 3600 and ahead of both the 11600K and 10600K. When compared to the older Core i3 10100F, we're talking about a 24% increase in 1% low performance. Moving on, we have Watch Dogs Legion, and although 97 FPS on average is one of the weaker results we have from the batch of CPUs tested, it still meant that the 12100F was 8% faster than the R5 3600 and 20% faster than the 10100F, so certainly strong gains there. Moreover, it was just 8% slower than the Ryzen 7 3800X and 10% slower than the Core i5 10600K, both of which are still very capable gaming processors. Moving on, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and the Village section of the game we use for testing is very CPU demanding. I was shocked to discover that the 12100F's 1% low performance was 51% stronger than that of the 10100F, and we're even looking at a 32% increase for the average frame rate. When compared to more expensive parts such as the 5600X, the 12100F was just 18% slower and 20% slower than the 12400. The Riftbreaker is another CPU intensive title, though like most games, single core performance is very important. As a result, the 12100F performs exceptionally well here, allowing for 126 FPS on average, and that meant it was comparable to the 10600K, 5600X and 11600K. Moreover, when looking at the 1% low figures, it was 45% faster than the 10100F and 33% faster when comparing the average frame rate. Next up we have Hitman 3, and here the 12100F was good for 154 FPS on average, which really is comparable to that of numerous current and previous generation mid-range processors, such as the 3700X, the 10600K, 11600K, and even the 12400. So a very strong result here and a massive 36% uplift over the old 10100F. Age of Empires 4 relies heavily on single core performance, so unsurprisingly the Core i3 12100F does very well, allowing for 190 FPS on average, which is basically the same level of performance you'll receive from the 12400. It's also a 27% increase from the 10100F and a 20% boost over the Ryzen 5 3600. Far Cry 6 is yet another recently released game that really only heavily taxes a single thread. So again, the Core i3 12100F does very well, delivering similar performance to that of the 11600K, 10600K, 10700K, and 3700X. Interestingly though, despite the heavy reliance on the primary thread, the Core i3 10100F does suffer from rather weak 1% low performance in Far Cry 6, whereas this wasn't an issue for the 12100F. Moving on, Horizon Zero Dawn isn't a core-heavy game, so we have yet another example where the 12100F performs really well relative to the more expensive CPUs. Basically, it's able to match the 12400, making it slightly faster than the 3700X and 10700K. Arguably the most CPU demanding game here is Cyberpunk 2077, and the Core i3 12100F was feeling the pressure a little bit, though overall performance was still excellent, basically matching the Ryzen 5 3600 and Ryzen 7 3700X. Still, it was 19% slower than the 10600K and 11600K, and then 24% slower than the 12400, so those extra cores and cache are certainly helping a lot here. Still, 102 FPS on average is very impressive performance, and it was a 16% boost over Intel's previous Core i3. Again, it's power consumption where the 12100F really does look impressive, increasing total system usage by just 10% over the 10100F for a 16% boost in performance. Basically, when paired with a mid-range graphics card, a 400 watt power supply would be considered overkill. Okay, so here's a look at the 10-game average data, and overall I think it's fair to say Intel's latest quad-core made out very well in many of today's games, especially given that we were often using slightly dialed down quality settings at 1080p with the Radeon RX 6900 XT. What this means is, for most gamers who will almost always be more GPU limited, the 12100F is going to fare even better. But it also means that when more CPU limited in today's games, the 12100F is often comparable to parts such as the Ryzen 7 3700X and Core i5 10600K, which is quite remarkable. It's also a huge step up from the Core i3 10100F, boosting 1% lows by 28% on average, with a 21% increase for the average frame rate. It's also typically quite a bit punchier than the Ryzen 5 3600, another great budget CPU from years past. Before wrapping things up, here's a quick look at operating temperatures with the RM1 box cooler. Running at the 58 watt spec, the 12100F never exceeded 78 degrees, and this temperature was reported inside the Corsair Obsidian 500D with an ambient room temperature of 21 degrees, so a good result overall. Unsurprisingly, with the power limits removed, we found the exact same result, 78 degree peak temperature with a sustained all-core frequency of 4.1 GHz. So really, most users should have no issue using the 12100F with the supplied box cooler. Well, I've got to say, the Core i3 12100F is even more impressive than I was expecting. Despite only packing 4 cores, the application performance was excellent, often rivaling that of previous generation 6-core 12-thread processors. And then when it came to gaming, it was much more capable than anticipated. Again, often matching higher core count parts from previous generations, and then offering a substantial performance gain over the previous Core i3 base model, the 10100F. For those of you building a new budget system, you really wouldn't even consider AMD, as the cheapest CPU they have on offer right now, from the likes of Newegg for example, would be the Ryzen 5 3100 for a ridiculous $175 US, so around $55 more than the 12100F for vastly inferior performance. Although I didn't test the R3 3100, I did test the much faster R5 3600, which was often slower than the 12100F, especially for gaming. The next best thing from AMD would be the 5600G, but at $260 US, it's a hard pass, assuming you're not after the iGPU, but even then I think it is questionable. So with AMD really out of the picture, the 12100F is unrivaled at $120 US, with the only potential alternative being the cheaper and slower 10100F. The newer 12th gen part will set you back around $35 for the CPU, and then about $30 for the motherboard, but you do end up getting a much faster system with a significantly better upgrade path should you choose to bolster your CPU performance in the future. All said and done, you can land the Core i3 12100F for around $120 US, a decent B660 motherboard for $140 US, and if you require the supporting DDR4 memory, a 16GB DDR4 3200CL16 kit can be had for just $60. And that means the total system upgrade is just $320 US, about what you'd pay for a Ryzen 5 5600X. That configuration is more than capable of tackling all of the latest games at sufficiently high frame rates, and I suspect it will be better than a make-do type solution for at least the next few years. Of course, having said all of that, the same package but with the 12400F instead, that'll set you back just $380, so that's a mere 20% increase or $60 US more, and that is for a better performing CPU that should last a bit longer into the future. Personally, I would go with the Core i5 12400F, but if you really do need to, let's say, penny pinch, then the 12100F on an entry-level B660 board is a good alternative. I'll also be checking out some H610 boards in the not too distant future, as they might make even more sense for those of you considering the 12100F, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, if you found this video useful, then please do give it a like. You can subscribe for more content. As I said, there's more stuff coming up. And also, we have Floatplane and Patreon. If you want to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, you'll get access to our exclusive Discord server where you can chat with Tim and myself. We do a live stream each month for Floatplane and Patreon members. Behind the scenes content, Q&As. So a lot of cool stuff there. If you're interested, check it out. But if not, perfectly fun. And I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. I'll see you again next time.